Welcome back, Gadgeteers. So I thought I would talk a little bit about troubleshooting with Linux. In specific, I'm referring to my 4K Brio camera, which I bought probably a year or two ago. And I started to have problems with it in Linux specifically. So what I've decided to do is I'm going to run through the basics, well, a little bit more than basics, that I like to go through when I'm doing troubleshooting on hardware or software. It really depends. And then what I'm going to talk about is specifically what I ended up doing to get my 4K Brio camera working under Linux again. So let's have a look. Alright, first and foremost, when you're doing any type of testing, you really have to look at it as a forensic study. And the other thing is, you really don't want to have to spend too much time doing testing, right? You want to get back to work. So my recommendation for the very first thing, mainly from experience, is power off your machine and pull the plug out of the back and wait at least 30 seconds. I have had so many problems fixed by simply pulling the plug out of the back, but make sure you do shut it down correctly. We don't want to introduce a new problem because you powered down your system. So you power it off, you pull the plug, you boot it back up, and you determine if the problem is still there or not. If it is, then we need to move forward, and we're going to go on to some other thing. One of the things that you can do that really helps is to run whatever command, whatever application you're trying to run in the command line. And I want to show you that. So here I've got the CLI open, and I'm going to go ahead and type in, it can be any application, it doesn't really matter. Let's try Audacity. Lots of output. Now, if I was having a problem, it does give me some suggestions. You can see all the variety of errors that I'm getting. The question is, do I need to go and research these? No, because currently I'm not having any problems with Audacity. That was not the case when I tried to run my Logitech 4K Brio. The symptom was that the camera would turn on, the light would turn on the camera, and I would see only a black screen in OBS or any other applications. So it really wasn't working at all. Alright, the next thing that I did, I went ahead and ran OS updates. I actually found out I was on Fedora 30, and 32 is the current one. And luckily, I also tried logging into a different desktop environment, in this case GNOME, which let me know, hey, you're on Fedora 30, do you want to do an upgrade? So I did. Now this can be a pretty big step, so do think about it before you decide to do it. But I wanted to do it. Number one, you can update the operating system, which is different than upgrade the operating system. Upgrade, of course, is going to be much more intensive. In the case of Fedora Linux, if you haven't done an update in a long time, in my case, I just went to the upgrade. Oh, after the upgrade, you should do an update. There shouldn't be any updates needed if you're running Linux, though, and you've just done an upgrade. Usually. Alright, we've got some command line output, and what are we going to do with that? Well, we'll highlight the text that we want to do a search on and click Edit and Copy. I'm going to do that for you right now. So, let's say this was the problem line. I would go ahead and highlight the text, copy it, cruise up to my browser, and paste it in. I would like to point out, when you do a search, just because you put this text in, it doesn't mean it's necessarily for your application in Linux, so keep that in mind. This is important. You really have to vary your search criteria. If you take this command line text and just paste it in and you don't see what you need to, you don't get the results you were hoping for, unfortunately it can take a little bit more work. One way is with quotation marks, and most of you know about this, I'm sure. Surround the text that you're trying to get information on in quotation marks. Next thing you can do. This text is so specific, it should be a Linux only error type message. However, there's the possibility that it's a Windows type message, but you could put in Linux. If you wanted to get even more specific, you could put in Fedora. If you wanted to get even more specific, you could put in the application that you're having a problem with. And we get very specific output now. So there is a possibility that you'll find it that way. The other thing is, when I was talking about varying my output, let's say Rhythmbox was crashing on reboot. I'm sorry, Audacity. Let's just say crashes on open. So we get totally different results. I'm not saying that this would be the result we want and it would fix the problem, but you've got to check using different results, or different searches, so that you get different results. The other thing you can do, believe it or not, so simple, try different search engines. Google, for example, will show usually very close to what DuckDuckGo shows, but you know, there will be some differences, so use a different search engine. I really recommend that. So you find a variety of documents. Here we have a big list, and some of them aren't really exactly what we were hoping for. Even if that's the case, make sure you go in and have a look at it. And this is the thinking part. Don't just scroll down and say, no, that's not my problem. Make sure that you're reading the text and thinking about what's going on and if it would work for you or not. It's possible it won't. Only make one change at a time. So we have this concept, you know, with experimentation, that we only want to change one variable at a time. If you change 5 things because you're impatient and you reboot your system, first of all, you may introduce new problems, and if your memory isn't really good or you haven't documented it, you may not remember how to reverse what you've done. One change at a time, whether it's a change inside the BIOS, whether it's a driver update, whether it's uninstalling a software package and reinstalling it, make sure that you are only changing one variable at a time. So you've went through several different web pages and forums, and you still haven't found what you were hoping to find to fix the problem. At this point, I usually recommend going to whatever forum where the answer was close, making a post, and try to get as specific with the information as possible. So the output from the command line will help. What version of Linux you're using, what distribution, what desktop environment, what application, what version of the application. Those are some things that get other troubleshooters started. And if you just say, I'm having a problem with an application, it keeps crashing, I'm not going to say that people in the forum will be annoyed, although it seems to happen. It doesn't matter if it's a Windows, Mac, or Linux forum. So try to give as much detail as you can to help with the troubleshooting, far beyond my application crashes, what should I do? Okay, next. This one's really important, probably the most important step that you could do. Sometimes if you're working really hard on a problem and you spend 5 or 6 hours working on it, note I said hours. The 4K Brio issue that I had, actually I was working on over 3 days, and I would say I spent 10 or 20 hours on it, and not all in one big block. So a little bit on one day, second day, third day. I really recommend that you take a break. So one of the things that happens when you take a break is that you release your mind from this kind of iron grip, focusing on only that one problem. And most people understand that Linux can do foreground applications and background applications. So think of it this way: you moved a particular thread into the background, which is, why isn't my piece of hardware working in Linux? So you move it into the background, and all of a sudden you're walking around an hour later, going for a walk or whatever, and you think, I gotta try this and this and this. And you're refreshed. You've given yourself several other things that you can try. If you do that, keep a journal. Make sure you cross off all the things you've tried so that you don't duplicate the problem, or rather duplicate the attempt to fix the problem. That's what I recommend. And the breaks are important. Sometimes the break will be a whole night. I had a lot of fun troubleshooting. People ask me, what are you, crazy? Why don't you just go to the forum and ask the question? Well, I learn the most about Linux when I do troubleshooting, and it's really fun to me. I know. I don't like to play games, but if there's a problem in Linux or Windows, I like to ferret it out. I like to find the problem and see if I can figure it out. And sometimes the problems can't be figured out by me. And this is where I come to another possible strategy that you could use. Wait 3 days and do OS updates. If you're having the problem with a given piece of hardware, there's a good chance several other people have it, and they've reported the report to bug tracking, which you can do too. If that's the case, wait a few days, do your updates, reboot, and see if it fixes the problem. I would say for me, half the time it fixes the problem. Now this next one, I put a huge asterisk in my journal. This one is not one you take lightly or you do just because a piece of hardware isn't working. So there's two things you can do. One, upgrade firmware for a given piece of hardware. And in this case, I upgraded the firmware for my 4K Brio camera. It was still on version 1.0. The version that was available was 2.5, so there had been many updates since I bought the 4K Brio camera. Now, I've heard people say this doesn't work, and I'm here to tell you, I had a laptop that would drain the battery by the time I got up in the morning, even though it was turned off, and I didn't understand it. Found out, of course, that newer laptops have firmware in the battery. In other words, they have a chip, a processor, that processes information related to battery usage and how much it should be giving and how little, and all kinds of information, a lot of stats about what the battery's doing. And so I did a firmware update of the battery, and after that the problem went away. So even something as minute, well, it's not minute, it's very important. Batteries can have firmware. Again, I don't recommend doing this unless you feel very confident and you've done some firmware updates before. If not, and you don't feel confident, talk to a couple people who do firmware updates and see what they say. The other thing that you can do is BIOS updates to your computer. BIOS updates are kind of like firmware updates for a piece of hardware, but it's actually for your computer. If you use the wrong BIOS update or firmware update for a piece of hardware, you could brick your particular piece of equipment. In this case, we're talking about BIOS updates, so you could brick your motherboard. What does it mean to brick something? It means that its value is that of a brick. So you try to install firmware and you got the wrong revision for your motherboard. So there's a B450, for example, and there's revisions 1, 2, and 3, and you didn't know which one it is, so you figured you'll just do Rev 3 because you think you got the latest board because you bought it last year, and it wasn't. It was revision 1, and you tried to load the BIOS, and it failed, and your computer, after that, would not boot up. So I don't recommend BIOS or firmware updates until you've exhausted all other avenues and you pretty much have done everything you can do, and you've talked to somebody else that's familiar with it, or you yourself are familiar with it. That's my recommendation. Another thing that you can try that I actually tried in my troubleshooting, we're getting a little bit more specific now, is to disable SELinux. And I want to show you that. So let's bring up the command line. Okay, so what you do is you go to the command line, and I believe this first one you can run no matter what level you are, whether you're root or not. So SELinux is a policy manager that basically stops applications and people from doing certain things that, in other words, we are enforcing so they're not able to do it. It can also cause problems with applications. So we're checking here, and we do get enforce, and we can see that we actually are in enforcing mode. So if we wanted to disable that just for a minute or two, we can do, and I'm going to run sudo set enforce 0. And of course I had done sudo earlier, so it took it right away. So now if we type get enforce, it's now set for permissive. Then you can go run the application right away and see what happens. If you reboot, I believe, but I haven't tested it in some time, the enforcement in SELinux will go back to enforcing. But if you want to be sure, we're going to do sudo set enforce 1. And then, of course, we can check get enforce again, and we can see that we're actually enforcing the SELinux profiles again. So for my particular problem with the 4K Brio camera, what did I do? Well, a lot of searching, and I like to say there's searching, there's search, and then there's research. And search is, of course, typing in an error and doing one search. Researching is to come at it from a different angle and say, well, this didn't work. I'm all out of attempts. I don't know what to do. I can't find what I need to find. When in reality, you can. Just try different search terms. So one of the things that I ran into was a recommendation to uninstall govcview and reinstall it. So I did. It didn't make any difference whatsoever. But I began to have a newer problem where govcview and OBS Studio would both crash when I started them up. And I didn't know what to think of that. I did some research. I used the command line to run both of those and see what types of errors I was getting, and then take the error content and paste it into a browser, which was very helpful. It kind of helped me start narrowing things down. And I had to take a break, got up the next day, and I said, well, why don't I see if root is able to run these applications? So I ran govcview as root, and it ran perfectly, and the camera came on. Then I ran OBS Studio, and it also was able to turn the camera on as long as I was booted as root. So I thought, well, that's really curious, and that's when I thought maybe I should turn off SELinux, and then if that doesn't work, I'll just turn it back on, and it did not work. I had just recently made a BIOS update to my desktop computer, and I thought, maybe that's the culprit. But before I did the BIOS downgrade, I booted into Windows to see if the camera would work with Windows. So if it was a BIOS issue, it's highly unlikely that it would work in Windows and not work in Linux. And anyway, it would be highly unlikely that the camera would work in Windows because we have a BIOS error somewhere. So I went ahead and logged into Windows, and the camera worked fine. So I thought, well, I doubt it's a BIOS issue, but I went ahead and downgraded the BIOS. I had just upgraded the BIOS to support the Ryzen 9 3950X. So I thought, I'll try it. I did the downgrade to the BIOS. It didn't make any difference. I figured, well, I might as well upgrade to the more recent BIOS again because it doesn't seem to make any difference. Remember what I was talking about, one variable at a time, one at a time. After that, I tried the 2 USB settings that were available, and neither one made any difference, so I left them. I restored them back to their original settings. I tried OS updates early in my troubleshooting, and then I tried the OS upgrade and got myself on Fedora 32, and there still was a problem. And I'm thinking, what now? What can I try? I installed the VL42-CTL utility. VL42 is driver wouldn't be really correct. It's kind of like a well, I guess you would call it a driver. I mean, in Windows parlance, it would be a driver, and it basically is one of the interfaces that works with our video when we take a camera and show it on OBS. And I was getting a pretty specific error about VL42, and somebody recommended installing the CTL application to see if I could get more information about the camera and things that were going wrong. I did use it, but it was fruitless, so I continued moving on. What else did I do? I've covered the major things I did, so I was kind of left at this point with searching. I knew it was only a problem with, one other thing I did try was logging in as a totally different user that wasn't root, and the camera would not work for that user either. It was a brand new user I created. When I logged in, it didn't work. So I knew the camera would work as root. I knew it would not work as user. I knew it was not SELinux. I knew that OS updates didn't have anything to do with it, and the upgrade didn't have anything to do with it. One of the things I was going to try but didn't try is putting a copy of Linux, whatever one, I was going to try Ubuntu, on a thumb drive and booting from that version of Ubuntu and seeing if the camera would work, which I have a suspicion it would have worked, which would have told me there's something wrong specifically with my distribution. And one of the things that I do talk about in, I can't remember what video it was, is bit rot, where in the case of this system, I've been upgrading it to new versions of Linux, Fedora Linux, for years. So as a matter of fact, the whole computer has been replaced, but I've still continued to do upgrades. So sometime you get aberrant behavior like this, and it basically is difficult to troubleshoot because it's something you actually got a while back. So bit rot, things just kind of start falling apart. There's too much baggage, too much stuff, and problems like this start to occur more and more often. This is the only real problem that I've had this type. So who knows? Okay, next. What did I do? Well, I'd gotten to the point where I was doing searching, a lot of it, researching, and I would change and basically try to search for different terms in different orders, go from general to very specific. A lot of times specific searches don't do very well. So if you're taking the error code and putting it into the browser under Google, and you get 5 hits and none of them help you, it's not over. I'm here to tell you. Sometimes you have to go to more general information. I finally hit on something that was interesting, but I wasn't really sure if it would help. And let me show you that. What I found was on the OBS site itself, and it was somebody talking about using the V4L2 plugin for the video capture device, in my case, of course, my Logitech Brio. And what the user was saying is you have to edit the JSON file in your scenes folder, or JSON, however you want to say that, and where you see it calling deb video 0, replace it with the actual ID. So all devices get a generic device like video 0, video 1 if you had multiple cameras. Sometimes, however, there's problems. In the case of my Logitech Brio, it actually showed 4 devices, 0 through 3. And basically none of them worked. I tried all of those video devices. So I thought, I'm going to make a backup of this file, and I'm going to go ahead and change mine. Now, of course, you see how it's got a different code. It is very specific, C922. I thought I'll change my file, my JSON file, and see what happens and if it works. But in order to do that, I had to know where the default installation was for OBS files. I had no idea, and I actually did research on that, and it wasn't coming up easily. There's a lot of stuff out there you have to be careful, because it's like a really old version, like 2015, and there's been several changes to OBS Studio or whatever application you're using. So I thought, well, this is really cool. I think that might be something I want to test. And I thought, but I really don't know what the default installation source is. So I just kept reading. Lots of things in here that were interesting, but not directly helpful. So I kept going and I kept going. And finally here, talking about pixel format, something that's not really related to the issues I'm having at all. But if you keep reading, you can see here is OBS Studio's default installation location. It wasn't in scenes, mind you, it was just in the basic folder, and then I had to go into the by-id folder, and I could see the name of the camera, and I selected the text of the name of the camera. And as a matter of fact, I want to show you that. Let's have a look at that. And pardon my typing, I'm terrible, I know it. So what I'm going to do, because I hate typing, is grab this. Now I'd like to point out that the first folder has a dot in front of it. It's important to understand that that dot, there, much better. That dot is important because it's a hidden folder. So if you try to open a file window here and you're in home mark, you're like, I don't see .config, and you won't. You won't see it. But you could put here .config. The dot, of course, means hidden. So we could do the command line, or we can go this way. So we're now in the .config folder. We need to go to OBS Studio and then Basic. Let's cruise over there. OBS Studio and Basic. And I believe it was Profiles. It's been a minute. Nope, it was not Profiles. So you do have to go in the Scenes folder. Ignore what I said earlier. Of course, before I made any changes, I went ahead and backed up this file here. Well, actually, no, this one's mine. When you back up files, the best bet is to always use some kind of letter combination in the file name that you always know. I always put .mrk as the end of the file. So if I do a search on my system for any files that I've changed, .mrk will be in there somewhere. Okay, let me show you, see if we can open this up. We don't really need Kwrite. How about a text editor? Alright, I've changed the color scheme here so it's slightly easier to read. And what are we looking for specifically? We're looking for, and let's see, this can do a search, I'm sure it can, find by ID right there. So I took this line here, device ID, and instead of it saying video 0, I change it to the specific ID of the camera right there. And one thing you want to check, of course, after you make this change, and you do this while OBS Studio is not running, is run it and see if it works. But you should also reboot your system. I recommend powering off again and back on, and then checking it again just to make sure it worked. I also found out there was something similar wrong with GovCView, which is another tool that I use to record video. So it was a very similar problem, and it wasn't too difficult to fix after I had sleuthed this out. These types of problems I'm very used to. The problem is I haven't encountered them in years, so it took me longer than it should have to do a search. Now, one of my viewers, Serge, probably if I had asked, would have had the answer in 3 minutes flat. So it's all based on experience. But again, the process of doing the research, of learning where files live, it was so much fun, and it taught me so much more about Linux that I'm embarrassed to say I probably have forgotten. But I really enjoyed that process. I have a lot of fun doing it. What frustrates me is when an answer isn't forthcoming very quickly. But each of us have our own limit as to how long we will say, okay, I've tried to figure this out. I don't know what the problem is. So get out there on the forums and ask other people. And of course, you might have help with a Linux guru somewhere directly, and you could get an answer really quickly. All right, is there anything else I need to talk about in this video? I think that's everything. I kind of went through stuff really fast. Hopefully it helps even just a little bit. With Linux, you got to stick in there, be patient, think about what you're reading. So we look at this website and we have to think about it. You really got to think about it. All I wanted was that piece of information, and it was right there for me. So a lot of times you can find what you need quickly and easily. Other times you can't. Just be patient, vary your searches, and you'll do fine. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe. You can dislike too if you want. Drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. All of those things help. And consider joining me on patreon.com/fastgadgets. I'll see you next time. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/fastgadgets.